Hello, here is a video I'm going to do in looking at perspective drawing and in particular in regards to cylindrical items. And this first one I'm going to focus very much in on everything that happens down here with the cylinders sitting on a common floor plane or ground plane, and just to make sure different ways of understanding the underlying ellipses and cylinders you can see, as well as ones where you can't see. It's blocked by everything. This one blocked by some things, and this one blocked by everything. So I'm going to talk about that and try to get to kind of a place where I understand the basics of how these cylinders would have the corresponding ellipses, and specifically how to think about them in this is 1-point perspective. But that's the idea here. So what I'm going to talk about first is just some general things about the ellipse in perspective. There's several important things to understand about how the shape relates to this rectangle in perspective. And in 1-point perspective, they're pretty similar in 1 and 2-point. That's a larger conversation. But sometimes in 1-point perspective, you'll have rectangles that end up like this, where both of the edges are actually left of vertical, or corresponding right of vertical, or sometimes exactly vertical. This is sort of the main one to kind of think about. But then I'm also going to real briefly just kind of talk about how to think of several ellipses, like the candle standing on a table or something. So let's get to that. I'll likely get to the this and specifically, but that may be the next video. We'll see how long this one goes. So first, I'm just thinking about overall exciting video. Overall circles in perspective. Hopefully the idea of some kind of rectangle in perspective is not new to you. I'm trying to think about how to describe this shape, besides obviously being sort of a wide trapezoid. I think it's seeming like it's the windshield, the back windshield of a car, maybe a car from the 80s, or I'm not sure, but or maybe the front of a car, I don't know. But either way, it's helping me just sort of think about that shape. So when we're drawing circles in perspective, it helps greatly to think of the perspective rectangle that circle is sitting in. And like other perspective drawing setups, it helps to make sure to identify the perspective middle center of that rectangle in perspective, and knowing that this will be a little bit closer to this point than it will be to this point, and just sort of stopping and thinking and reminding yourself that things that are further away appear shorter in perspective, that would make sense. This would appear longer, that would appear shorter because it's further away from the viewer. But the important thing to also remember is that the shape of the ellipse within this is still going to follow the idea of a minor axis and a major axis, with everything being equidistant from each other. So this mark I'm placing straighten that guy up just a touch, just because I want to think about is definitely halfway between these 2 points, and then I'm going to use that as the major axis to help me with the widest points of the actual ellipse. At the same time, it is still true that the ellipse will be going through these 4 points, which is somewhat counterintuitive. But I'll try to continue to explain. As the ellipse circle is coming around this way, it will touch through that point, but because of this angle, it can sort of doesn't have to be turning around right at that point. It can continue on just a touch and actually not sort of turn around until this widest point. So there's a lot of stuff going on here. But in my humble opinion, it's all very important stuff. So that ellipse will be something like that, and I'm being sort of semi-non-technical, but hopefully that is making sense. So I can still think about this rectangular aspect as well as this perspective rectangle aspect. And they're both sort of helpful and important to think about here, and I hopefully that makes sense. Sometimes, as if that wasn't enough, when you have when you're doing a perspective drawing and you end up with a grid, perhaps where where one of the rectangles in perspective is this sort of shape, trapezoid shape. Is that still a trapezoid? I'm not sure. Does a trapezoid mean that has to be? Anyways, I think maybe it does. have to go check later. But same kind of thing. I'm going to do a crisscross to find my perspective middle. Because this is 1 point perspective, I can sort of think of just the halfway point to get the angle of that center perspective line. And where they cross will give me my perspective center. And I still want to think about the ellipse going through all of these points. But at the same time, it's going to be slightly lower, and I want to think about still the straight up and down minor axis and the major axis being, I'm not gonna lie, this one is odd to me. It may not technically sort of jive up. It's maybe one of the places in perspective where if you want to get super technical you can figure that out, but I think I'm just going to fudge a little bit. Because this point would definitely, if it went through something here and then could, as the widest as the point at the end of the major axis, it could keep going a little bit until it goes through that one, sort of the opposite of here. But the definition of the major axis is that it's the widest point. So this is partly to say I'm going to fudge a little bit, and if you want to really understand the exact technical aspects of all of this, knock yourself out. Send me an email. But for the most part, what happens is that for me is that it just ends up being an ellipse, something like that. Perhaps technically at this point it's tilted ever so little that that would compensate for that. I'm obsessing on that, I confess. I also just try to make sure that I think of, if it is in this sort of orientation, that it's still possible to think of this as its own entity. You can sort of always think of a circle in 1 point perspective as acting that way too. So that's a little bit about that and how that sort of plays out in a bigger grid situation. If, say, for example, this is a rectangle or a table, yeah, some sort of rectangle that has where cylindrical objects are sitting on. I'm going to imagine 4 of them at this point right now. I'm going to again find my crisscross. There's the center line. Here's this perspective center of this larger rectangle, but now I'm going to break this up into a grid, a 2 by 2 grid. So now I'll be thinking of ellipses in each of these rectangles here. So by the time things get pretty squished, it gets tricky to sort of determine this sort of difference in distance. But it's still important to keep that in mind. So I feel like perspective center for that one is about there. About there for that one. About there for that one. We'll see how this goes. I may be wishing I got my ruler out, but for right now I'm just going to keep going. Something about that line, as well as that. Those are both pointing towards the vanishing point, aiming towards the vanishing point. All of these are, and just to be clear, each of these has their own. I'm not trying to sync up all of these things with one common vanishing point, so hopefully that hasn't confused you, but it probably has. But at this point, I would either set up my points that I know things are going through, which if you've never done this, I encourage you to do. At the same time, it's still sort of, not sort of, I think it's still helpful to get some speed on it and to get some flowing motion, and to know that you're not going to nail it on the first time. There's all sorts of different ways of drawing ellipses. Some fast, some slow, some in the middle. But the thing I want to make sure of is that this ellipse is more open than this one, because that's getting further away. This one is further away, so it will appear less open. Let's see if I can do a similar thing. This is definitely how I would be blocking them in. Let me see. Let's get a little more serious for this one. So it was interesting to notice the effect of slowing down and speeding up. Slowing down seems to give more technical accuracy, but also can suck the life right out of the artist and the drawing, in my humble opinion. But that's a nice conversation over a beer or something. So this video is long enough, I think, probably, with some stuff. So for the next video, I'll dig into the specific candle image and how I would address the candles and the subsequent ellipses on the ground plane for that specific scene. But in general, go set up a bunch of grids like this. There's a as long as it seems like it's possible that it would be a square in perspective, you'll be fine. There are technical ways, really technical ways of confirming whether that would be exactly a square in perspective or a rectangle, but that's a whole other thing. So check that out, and I'll look for you in the next video.